You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Jennifer Murtazashvil of the University of Pittsburgh. Jennifer, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Hi, Garrett. Thanks for having me.
Happy to have you. So our topic for today is a book you've written entitled Informal Order and the State in Afghanistan. Do you want to start by telling me what drew you to this topic? It's certainly interesting, but quite difficult to study.
Difficult, but really quite fun. Before I started doing research in Afghanistan, I had lived for 5 years in a neighboring country of Uzbekistan. And Uzbekistan shares a border, shares history, shares culture with neighboring Afghanistan. And when I was living in Uzbekistan, I noticed in these communities that there was a very well-structured, well-organized way for communities to solve problems. And unlike Afghanistan, which many of us consider to be quite stateless, Uzbekistan was one of the most authoritarian states on the face of the earth. So, think of Syria, think of North Korea. Until a couple of years ago, that country ranked way down there on many of these global indicators of human freedom. And despite such authoritarianism, I noticed the resilience of these communities to solve problems. Well, fast forward a couple of years to post-2001 Afghanistan. And I was actually watching much of this, the transition take place in Afghanistan after 2001, the fall of the Taliban government and so forth. And what I noticed was the description of community life in Afghanistan really paralleled many of those things that I had seen in Uzbekistan. And many of the names of the community organizations were the same. Many of the names of the actors were the same because these countries share borders, right? I mean, there was no difference between these places politically 150 years ago. So actually, I was unable to do research in Uzbekistan. I had gone back to graduate school intending to focus on former Soviet Central Asia. And because of the authoritarian nature of that government, I was unable to do research there. And so I started looking at the possibility of doing work in Afghanistan because of the similarities. In fact, I spoke one of the languages, Dari, which is a dialect of Persian, which I began learning when I lived in Uzbekistan. Very long story. But I noticed a lot of similarities between these two countries. And so when I started exploring the possibility of doing work in Afghanistan, I could see that communities had similar issues to those that I had seen up north, but the government wasn't around. And what I noticed was that there's this narrative from many folks in the donor community that Afghanistan was the tabula rasa, that during the course of the past 30 years, social institutions had been wiped out. And what I found was actually something quite different. And this is what motivated me to do this work, was really to understand the resilience of communities in Central Asia.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, we see similar things in other places where there's not so much government. We've definitely talked about Somalia on this show in the past, but of course every place is different and every culture governs themselves in different ways. Do you want to give some of the background on Afghan history? What should listeners know to really understand the country well enough to sort of have the baseline for this, the informal orders you study in your book?
So I think one of the things that's really important for folks to understand is that the people of Afghanistan really have never had a fighting chance vis-a-vis the state. And it's easy for us to look at what's happened over the past 15, 20 years. It's almost been 20 years since September 11th, 2001, right? When the state building effort really began. Is we look at the sort of massive failure, and it's easy for us to blame the Afghans and Afghan citizens. And we look at these pictures of Afghanistan as this really, sort of backwards looking place and full of corruption and dysfunction. And what's important for folks to take away from this is historically, you have these communities that have this incredible ability to govern themselves. Actually very similar to Somalia in many ways. but a government that has never appreciated it or seen the communities as an asset. They have always seen communities as an adversary. And during the periods of stability in the country, there was actually this period of what they called the long peace from about 1933 to the late 1970s. And Afghans will say, look, Europeans, you were fighting World War I, World War II. How many hundreds of millions died during that period? And we were relatively peaceful. And during that period of peace, the central government did not make any concerted attempt to co-opt or rule communities. Instead, they engaged them largely as partners. And that was a really unusual period of history. It wasn't a democratic period. It was, sort of light authoritarianism, but the central government wasn't too interested in extracting from communities. It didn't want to rule communities directly. And that's a very different picture than what we see today, where you see a very, very centralized form of government that really doesn't allow much in terms of community participation in political decision making. And it really reflects what we saw during the 1970s and 80s, during the communist period of Afghan history. So really this instability in Afghanistan, I really correlate with high forms of centralization of the government that have not given communities really a chance to have a seat at the table. And, if we're going to talk about Afghan history, a lot of this has its origins actually in the late 19th, early 20th century with a ruler who Afghans refer to as the Iron Emir. And his name was Abdurrahman Khan. And he was one of the cruelest leaders in Afghan history. And he actually chronicled a lot of his cruelty in an autobiography that he penned in English. So you can actually go to Google Books and download it for free. And in this autobiography, he talked about the need to stamp out the evil middlemen who were these community elders. He talked about how he would launch adversaries out of cannons. He would talk about the enormous cruelty that he himself imposed on Afghan society in order to rule it directly. So he talked about the need to get rid of all of these messy, customary forms of governance in order to impose sort of beautiful, hierarchical government. And I think that model, although without some of the cruelty, has actually inspired many Afghan rulers in recent years.
That's worrisome that that would be the inspiration for later governments.
Well, without the violence, right? But this notion that there's this messy stuff at the community level, and we can't really quite control it, and the rules that govern these communities these rules are not derived from the state, right? And so they're derived from custom, they're derived from tradition, they're derived from religion, and they're sort of a messy combination of the three. And we think of, what is the rule of law in this really sort of Weberian sense? It's, rules that are derived from the state. And so I think a lot of rulers try to emulate this model, not with the sort of harsh violence that he's had, but really trying to eliminate these, unusual, unwieldy sources of authority and in lieu of something that the state could offer. But yet the state never really offered a coherent alternative.
Mm-hmm. So, as you mentioned, Afghanistan was briefly a Soviet state. During that period, were the Russians able to sort of impose a communist government? Did it work like other sort of communist states, or was it mostly dysfunctional? I mean, in the sense of not being able to impose its will, not dysfunctional in the sense of every communist government.
Right. Actually, so it's funny you ask, because I'm actually working on a book project on this topic right now with an Afghan scholar whose name is Mohammad Kadam Shah. And we're looking at actually the institutional legacies of the Soviet system of public administration in current day Afghanistan. And Afghanistan was never Soviet, but it was communist. It was under the Soviets invaded it, and it was under their sphere of influence. And the reason that many historians give as to why the Soviets invaded, I think will surprise a lot of people. We look and see, okay, the Soviets really wanted to control it. They wanted to, extend the rid of their empire. But actually, a lot of the archival work now shows that the reason the Soviets invaded is because they thought the Afghan Communist Party was out of control, and that they were actually more Leninist than Lenin. That if you go back to, think about Marxism 101 with the proletariat, and in Afghanistan, there was no industrialization. There really was no proletariat to speak of, even less than, in Russia during the period of the Russian Revolution. And the Afghan Communist Party the revolution in Afghanistan in 1979 was led by this very extreme faction of the Afghan Communist Party who believed that they could get to the revolution in a day. And Marxism was, believed in a much slower period, right? To raise people out of their false consciousness. There's this education that has to take place. And the Leninists believed that you could use violence, right, to achieve this goal. And the Afghan communists believed in, hyper violence and hyper progress in order to get people to communism. And so they enacted these reforms like collectivizing agriculture immediately, getting rid of the bride price. They enacted a lot of social reforms in a really conservative rural society. And the Afghans actually saw this, and they had learned their lessons from what they had tried to do in Soviet Central Asia, right? Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, those stands right next door. They realized, they understood very well that you couldn't just do this in one day. To achieve communism was a long-term commitment. And they saw that these Afghan communist leaders in Kabul were sparking a rebellion against them. And this rebellion had quickly turned violent. It had led to the assassination of some Soviet advisors in different parts of Afghanistan. And they could see that the country was quickly headed towards civil war. So they thought that by invading, they could actually bring stability to the country. And what they did is they installed a much more moderate faction of the Afghan Communist Party. Now, of course, their invasion was also a miscalculation, right? That it triggered its own backlash, and that was the Mujahideen. But they had already started forming after the first revolution, after the first Afghan Communist Revolution in 1978. But the question was about the influence of the Soviets or the communists inside of Afghanistan. And actually, we trace this to, there were some investments beginning in the 30s and the 40s, but really in 1956, the Afghan government had its first 5-year plan. And this coincided with the return of Soviet internationalism, which the Soviets under Khrushchev embraced after the death of Stalin. So after the death of Stalin, Khrushchev sort of began to look outwards towards what we then called the third world, the developing world, to see how the Soviet Union could export its model. And so one of Khrushchev's first trips was in 1955, was to Kabul. I think he visited Kabul, Afghanistan, India, and Myanmar to export their model of communism. And in 1956, the Afghans began instituting 5-year plans. So the influence of the Soviets actually began much earlier. And one of the things I'm working on in this book is looking at how the Soviets really began to build the Afghan state beginning in this period with a very centralized form of bureaucracy, centralized form of public management. Think of all these kind of centralized institutions, central planning that you would associate with the Soviets. And then what happened, fast forward 50, 60 years to 2001, international donors come into Afghanistan and they think there's nothing there, right? They think nothing has survived. It's a tabula rasa. You got to start over. But one of the things that the international community did with the Bonn Agreement in 2001, which was this interim agreement that brought in Hamid Karzai and interim government, enacted the 1964 Constitution as the interim rule of law. And it did not abolish all the laws that had come since then. So it didn't restructure the system of public management, public administration, the way government was organized. So what the donors did, and this is sort of the topic of our book, is the donors who came into Afghanistan after 2001, rather than reforming government, actually strengthened old dysfunctional systems that were based, many of which were based on these old Soviet central planning models. And so what we argue is that a lot of the dysfunction that you see in the corruption that you see now comes from the fact that no matter how much money the international donor community would have pumped into Afghanistan, these institutions never would have functioned well. And so rather than, focusing on reforming or decentralizing or reorganizing government, the donors actually created a really dysfunctional monster. And that monster has driven citizen dissatisfaction. So, you look at scholars of insurgency, you look at scholars of Afghanistan, and we all have many disagreements about what to do, about what's going on in Afghanistan, but all of us agree. I can't think of anybody who disagrees that the driver of the insurgency today in Afghanistan is the government. It's dissatisfaction with the government. It is corruption in the government. And we trace that to history and to these old communist institutions.
Okay, so to recap, I am realizing I'm not as familiar with Afghan history as I maybe thought I was, but so the communist government in Afghanistan dates to, the mid-20th century, and it was not imposed by a Soviet invasion. It was sort of it was part of their sphere of influence. But
so there was a revolution in 1978, right? That's what brought the communists to power. And then the Soviets invaded a year later in 1979, and they actually deposed a faction of the Afghan Communist Party called the Khalqis, the People's Party, the People's Faction. And they installed a more moderate faction of the Afghan Communist Party. So they were not the ones who brought communism to Afghanistan. The revolution had already taken place. So when Afghans speak of the communist revolution, they call it the Sauer Revolution. That was 1978. It was the Soviets who invaded in 1979. So it's an interesting fact that I think a lot of us, many people don't know about Afghanistan. But the influence of the Soviets began much earlier under the monarchy in the 1950s.
So the Soviets were sort of using more soft power, influencing the Afghan state decades before the Afghans spontaneously had their own communist revolution, and then the Soviets invaded to bring them to heel. That's really interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. So the monarchy was sort of this classic rentier state. So, I spoke of this long peace, right? What enabled this long peace during the mid-20th century was the fact that the Afghan government wasn't relying on its citizens at all for revenue. It was allowing the United States and the Soviets to compete for attention, for the ruling party's attention. So the Soviets were investing quite a lot. The Americans were investing quite a lot. And it's really interesting that the Americans were investing in the South, in areas around Kandahar. And the Americans actually built Kandahar Airport, and it was in the 60s that was built. And then the Soviets had influence in the north, right next to their own border, next to the Soviet border in the north. And that's where they were investing heavily. So if you look at current day infrastructure in Afghanistan in the north, you'll see a lot of Soviet buildings. And in fact, I had an interview. I was interviewing some professors in Mazar-e-Sharif, which is one of the largest cities in Afghanistan. It's in the north, not far from the border with Uzbekistan, I'm sorry. And these professors were saying, they were political scientists, actually. They were criticizing the U.S. effort, the international effort, talking about, this idea that, okay, we understand that you want to teach people how to fish. You don't want to give us fish. But the Soviets, they had a very different development model. And in fact, you're sitting in it right now. And the Soviets, they built this building. They built our university, Balkh University in Mazar-e-Sharif. And they said, look, this has stood the test of time. We don't really understand. You Americans are putting so much money, but we don't see the result of that investment. Mm-hmm. Because you're so committed not to doing what the Soviets did. It's teaching people how to fish and not giving us these buildings. It's a very different approach.
Okay, so just to fill in the timeline a little, after the fall of the Soviet Union, but before the War on Terror, what was going on in Afghanistan?
So after the fall of the Afghanistan had this communist revolution in 1978, 1979, the Soviets invaded. That triggered a civil war, right, which ended it's really actually hasn't ended. Unfortunately for the people of Afghanistan, it's manifested in one way or the other, but that's what people point to as triggering this many years of fighting. So the civil war continued until about 1992. The Soviets withdrew in 1989. Okay. And everybody expected that communist-backed government to fall immediately. They actually hung on until 1992. They stayed in power, and they were overthrown by these mujahideen commanders. And the mujahideen, right, translates as holy warriors. These were sort of the Islamic-based fighters. They weren't Taliban, who were fighting the Soviets. Okay. This is sort of precursor to the time. These were the warlords and the commanders who now are in power in Afghanistan. So in 1992, the communist government fell. And the leader of Afghanistan was this guy named Najibullah. In 92, he actually went in hiding in the UN compound in Kabul, where he remained until 1996, when the Taliban came to power. And one of the first things they did when they stormed Kabul in 1996 was they took him out of the compound and they hung him and they castrated him on a street pole in the middle of Kabul, a very famous intersection. And it was a symbol, right, of the people's hatred towards the communists, and especially the Taliban's hatred towards the communists. But it's interesting that he survived until 1996 and spent 4 years holed up in a UN compound. But so the Taliban came to power in 96, and their form of government, as I think we all know, was very different from the Mujahideen were Islamic, but the Taliban had this very, what we call Wahhabi influenced, Deobandi influenced, really austere form of Islam that, we know the stories about putting women in burqas, banning women from attending schools, this very, severe form of religious law that they imposed. And that continued in Afghanistan until 2001. Right. So they were only in power for about 5 years, and they actually never controlled the entire country. So in 2001, then their government was toppled by the United States Special Forces, and together with some of these former Mujahideen warlords who fought against the Taliban. And they were toppled in 2001. And so for several years, it seemed like the Taliban had gone away. Things were quiet. And it was like 2004, 2005, they really began their insurgency, what they call the neo-insurgency against U.S. forces and the Afghan government. And that's an insurgency that's been going on ever since.
Yeah, I think where most people's knowledge of the country sort of started was 2001. And I think a lot of it was essentially war propaganda, right? Look at this very backward place. Look what they do to women. We need to go save them, kind of. And some of it was, they were true stories about what was happening to women then. But I think there wasn't a realization of just how short-lived this Taliban Afghanistan was. I think a lot of people got the impression that this is just the way Afghanistan always had been.
Exactly. And that's actually one of the struggles I have in explaining my research, because I talk about the virtues of traditional governance in Afghanistan. And if I show a picture of what a community elder looks like, it's someone with a turban and a white beard. And to most people, that's the Taliban, right, to the West. And they're saying, well, you're saying the Taliban is good. And I said, no, this is different from the Taliban. And in fact, one of the strategies that the Taliban had when they came to communities was to kill off these elders and these community leaders because they were legitimate. They had the backing of people in their community, and often they were selected. Usually they were selected by members of their community to lead them. In many cases, these individuals, these were not chiefs. These were not hereditary rulers. These were not feudal lords. And that's actually the story I tell in my book, is that so often when we think about traditional leaders, so in addition to sort of misunderstanding who these people are, they're not Taliban. Yes, they're deeply religious, but that form of religion is very, very different from that Wahhabi, very austere version of Islam that the Taliban brought with them from Pakistan. And the Taliban got that in Pakistan vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, right? The old traditional form of Islam in Afghanistan was much more tolerant, much more diverse, and accepted different kinds of religious communities, whether they were Jewish communities or Sikhs. There was actually a large Sikh population that lived in Afghanistan. That it was a very diverse community, and also in terms of Shia versus Sunni versus Ismaili, which is another very common sect of Islam that you'll find in Afghanistan. So it was a much more diverse country in terms of the way that these traditional leaders accepted diversity. So that's one stereotype that I'm always fighting against, and that these things are actually virtuous because they're legitimate. And what I do in my book is I open up the rules of traditional authority to try to understand why these traditional leaders have persevered. What makes them tick? A lot of people just point to them as saying, oh, these are just traditional leaders. They've been around forever. People just listen to them blindly. It's just tradition. Or they'll just call them chiefs, right? And I show actually they're not chiefs at all. There's actually no such thing as a chief in Afghanistan, much to the surprise of many. And I'll explain why in a second. But these leaders have a lot of legitimacy, and they have continued during the war. And one of the things that really surprised me in my work was the ability of communities to resurrect these traditional forms of governance after 2001. So during these devastating period of civil conflict, many Afghans fled, right? If they were in villages, they fled to cities. If they were living in cities, they fled to Pakistan. They fled to Iran. They fled to Australia. They came to the United States. They went all over the world. And what happened after 2001 is many Afghans actually returned back to their communities. And one of the first things they did was reconstruct their old ways of doing things, their old institutions. And that was their village-based customary authority. But what I found was that sometimes they would use new names to describe old leaders. For example, a very common name was a Khan. In some places, a Khan was a large landowner, but not in every place. And when I came back, when people came back to their communities, instead of using that word Khan, they would use a word like Namayenda, which translates as representative. But they would use, even though they chose a different title to describe this person, the person had the same job that they had before. And this was to adjudicate disputes, to solve land issues, to help people access government services, to really sort of be the mayor of a village and to represent the community's interests to the outside world. And that was a function that had existed for, centuries. But people updated the technology of governance, and they updated the names, and they updated their expectations of what that person should do. They were no longer content to be subjects of anybody. I think war really rattled people. So people's expectations of people they chose to represent them in this post-2001 period are really, really high. And that's why you see this continued insurgency, because people are just not willing to accept authoritarianism. They're not willing to accept, any kind of iron fist.
Okay, so rather than being a chief or, someone who sort of just gets to boss people around, they're more of a representative or someone who helps the community to settle disputes. They're in a position of authority, but they have customary rules that limit their authority and that don't let them be tyrannical or even...
Exactly. Yeah. They're constrained.
Yeah. Okay. So that sounds good. That sounds like a system that works fairly well. I see you have a section in your book about the political economy of these villages and how they provide local public goods. I recently did an episode on the work of Elinor Ostrom on the show, so that's So how about you describe how these villages supply public goods?
So it's funny you mentioned that, because honestly, I wouldn't have written this book without Ostrom's work. Mm-hmm. And without Ostrom, I probably never would have made it through graduate school. I'm a political scientist, And I was really bored with a lot of things that I read in political science. And it wasn't until I found her work and some of the work in the political economy of development that I was actually really inspired. That work reflected a lot of the reality that I saw, for example, on the ground during my time in the Peace Corps, during my time in former Soviet Central Asia. And it reflected really important questions, right? And so in Ostrom's work, if you've read Governing the Commons, she has these set of design principles, right? I don't know how much you remember of Governing the Commons, but it's her most famous work where she describes, these are the different design principles that characterize the management of the commons, like effective management of the commons. And one of the rules that she has, I think it's design principle number 7, is that the state needs to recognize these rules for them really to be effective. And I read that and I said, well, what happens if you can't satisfy design principle number 7? What if you're in a place like Afghanistan where the state can't recognize them or won't? Can you get the same outcome? And I find yes, actually. And so a lot of what I did was so inspired by her work. So she looks at, her key dependent variable, the key outcome that she's looking at was common pool resources for most of her work. But I look at other things like dispute resolution. I also look at common pool resources. I look at property disputes and things like that. And what I found in terms of the political economy was that by opening up the black box and trying to understand the rules that govern tradition, rather than just saying it's tradition, I found that communities are able to provide public goods when leaders are constrained, when leaders are able to collect local sources of revenue. So this is sort of one mistake that people often assume is that outside assistance is not the same as internally collected revenue. And villagers in rural Afghanistan, they have money to pay their leaders, their local community-based leaders. And they hold those leaders, if they give them 2 cents, they will hold them to account they're much more willing to hold them to account than they will, a donor will throw $500,000 into their village. They feel that they can't hold those donors accountable, but they can hold their local leader accountable for giving them, 2 cents to do something with. And so that local source of revenue is really important. But these constraints, I found that there's constraints within these communities because you have leaders. There is not just one leader in a village. And this is sort of the key to public goods provision. So I found that when communities were able to provide public goods, it was because they had separated authority. So in a typical village, I would find a leader who I call a malik. This was a Khan or a Namayenda, these names I described earlier. You have a leader, a village leader, who is not a chief, but I describe this person as sort of the first among equals. You also have village councils. This is sort of the second most important body. And typically these are called shuras or jirgas. And these are village councils that meet to solve issues when they arise. So they're kind of ad hoc councils that meet regularly to solve issues. And then finally, the third part of this triangle are religious leaders, or mullahs. So in every village, you have authority that's separated between these 3 distinct bodies. And not only do you have power that's separated, but there are checks and balances that exist between them. And this is actually the key, is that if you have a village leader who starts taking too much money, who starts behaving badly, and yes, I found those too, right? This goes back to Federalist 51. If all men were angels, we wouldn't need laws, right? Mm. So Afghans have these informal laws that govern the way their communities do business. And they know that no leader is an angel. And that's why they have these different bodies that can check and constrain the power of individual leaders. And it's these constraints, these checks and balances amongst separated powers. That's what enables the provision of public goods within communities. And that's what I found makes Afghanistan really special in terms of the power of this customary or traditional authority. So when we're trying to compare, traditional authorities across countries, not every country is going to have its traditional authorities structured like what you see in Afghanistan. right? In some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, you'll find chiefs, right, who rule with an iron fist, and you won't find these constraints on authority, and you won't find separated powers. But Afghanistan has this really diffuse power structure within communities. And that's what makes these communities so self-sufficient in terms of public goods provision, although there's limits to that, which I discuss in the book. But it also creates the biggest political challenge for the government. Because these communities have rules that are so well entrenched, it makes it really hard for governments to find a way to interact with them. And I think that's been the biggest challenge to finding political stability in Afghanistan throughout its history.
Right. Yeah. Throughout its history, and in particular over the last, has it been 18 years that that Afghanistan has been occupied by foreign powers? Not by the current set of foreign powers, who are still there, and I'm not quite sure what they're doing there still, but they're there.
Right. So I just want to say a little bit about this word occupation. Mm-hmm. I've interviewed hundreds of Afghans over the course of many years, and there was a lot of support for the United States and for the coalition in the days after 2001. Many Afghans did not see the United States as an occupying force, and I don't think many still do not. Some do. The Taliban certainly do. The Taliban say that that they will not even. They'll only negotiate with the United States. They won't even acknowledge the current Afghan government because the current Afghan government are just puppets of the colonizers, right? The imperial forces. And that's the United States. But I think we have to be careful when we talk about, the U.S. as an imperial power there. I think it's much more complicated. In fact, I remember it must have been 2007. I interviewed a former fighter in a village north of Kabul. And he said to me, he says, "I love you Americans." And of course, people are going to say this to me, right? I mean, I'm an American. So I also have to be aware of desirability bias and things like that. But he says, we love America. We love what you're trying to do here. But you made one mistake. You're Bush. And I think it was actually under Obama. Obama was already president. But, news hadn't traveled. Bush made one mistake. He's taken all of our weapons away. There was an effort, and it's a really common practice, actually, in many post-conflict environments, what they call demobilization, where you try to, demobilize the factions, the warlords, and you try to reintegrate them into society. And often this is done by integrating them into the military, the formal state military. And he says, "You took away our weapons, and we gave you our weapons. And this was a mistake because we could have used those weapons to fight the Taliban. And we could have just done it ourselves." So, there were some communities where there's real disgust, I think, more than anything, with the amount of money that's been wasted. And now, of course, the U.S. military has been very controversial. Not everyone likes it, but I think it's, increasing resentment towards the U.S. because of a lack of clarity about strategy. But I think people's opinions about this are quite nuanced, and it's never black and white. And I think that's something we have to remember about Afghanistan or just about anybody anywhere else.
Yeah, that's interesting about taking their weapons away. And it sort of speaks to why America is still there. It's like a medical treatment that fights the infection, but also wipes out your immune system. Then you just need to keep getting the treatment because you can't fight off. You can't fight things yourself.
The root causes.
Yeah. And when they remove the weapons from everyone except the Taliban, because obviously they wouldn't give their weapons back, now America has to stay and fight the Taliban, or they'll take over because everyone else has been disarmed.
Right. And the U.S. has made, there's been so many strategies over the years. At one point, and in fact, I think the U.S. military, the strategy has been a failure. And this is a political problem, right? And I don't know if you're familiar with Chris Coyne's work, but he's written this brilliant book called After War. And, he talks about how democracies really are not good at doing this kind of post-conflict reconstruction because the time horizons of democratically elected leaders are never going to be long enough to do the kinds of things that you have to do. And I think Afghanistan's just a case study of this. So, President Obama in 2009, he announced this huge military surge But yet the same day that he announced a surge, he said that we're going to withdraw within 2 years. 2 years, right? 2011. So the same day he announced a surge, he announced a withdrawal. And Afghans heard withdrawal. And so they took their money and ran. And I think that's when you really saw things fall apart, was actually 2009, 2010, when people realized that the U.S. was just headed out. And so that the U.S. withdrawal has been going on now for a decade. And no one's really sure what U.S. strategy is, why, what the U.S. is fighting for. I've spoken to hundreds of soldiers over the years at the invitation of the U.S. military, and who are, they're interested in understanding, dynamics within communities. And they'll ask me to talk about my research and things. And I'll have soldiers ask me, what is the strategy? And I'm like, that's not I can't answer that question. Why are we there? I can't answer that question. But it's easy to say that, just as I worry that it's easy to say just withdraw, but withdrawal will be hard and it will be painful for many Afghans. So I think we have to think very carefully about what that withdrawal will look like. And it's very politically popular now to say pull out, but we need to think more carefully about how to do it. Just as we say that, we create these nirvana fallacies by intervening. We think we can fix everything. We're not just going to fix everything by leaving either. So it would be great if we had more attention on how do we get out. It's easy to say just get out, but the world is actually so much more complicated.
Yeah. It really seems in retrospect like like it was a very bad decision to intervene in the first place, that given just how long it's been and how little sort of success has been achieved from, any perspective of any of the goals that the coalition had entering Afghanistan nearly 20 years ago. But, do you think they could have done significantly better had they understood more about the way the country worked and the way these villages worked?
Right. So, it's once again, it's complicated. I think a lot of Afghans would disagree. I think they don't see the intervention itself as a mistake, but they see a lot of mistakes made. I can't even tell you the difference in Afghanistan now versus the time when I first started visiting. There was hardly a university to speak of. And now you have highly trained, incredible students who are trained at institutions of higher education inside the country. There's been massive investments in education. Literacy rates are up. Huge. And that's going to have a transformative effect on the country in the long run. But there were obviously huge mistakes made in terms of, the ambitious desire to transform the country, right? And sort of gets back to this point that I made earlier, is that we assumed that there was nothing there. The U.S. did, coalition partners did, the UN did. And so everything had to be rebuilt from scratch. And this required a massive investment. It required getting involved in just about every aspect of society. And I think that was a huge mistake. And by, in the early days, Bush was criticized for what he called the light footprint intervention. But this didn't stem the Taliban insurgency. And a lot of people said that the United States was distracted by the war in Iraq. And as a result, the Taliban insurgency grew inside of Afghanistan and there weren't enough soldiers. But I think that if we look at the problem, not as a military problem, but as a governance problem, that the U.S. and others could have focused on this issue in a very different way and enabled communities to govern themselves, not just through aid programs. There's a lot of money spent on village governance, but it actually didn't structurally change the heavily centralized form of government that the country has had. And that heavy form of centralization that really has its origins back in the 1950s and with the communists, right? And with communist influence, Soviet influence in Afghanistan. And the country's always been centralized, de facto, de jure, always had a very centralized form of government. Under the monarchy, it was that communist influence, Soviet influence that strengthened that centralization. If there would have been a nod towards more decentralization, more local autonomy, enabling communities to make decisions, provinces to make their own political decisions about how they raised their revenue and how they spent that revenue, I think you would have had a lot less corruption. And you would have had reduced desires for individuals to feel that deep sense of alienation they have felt over the past several years, to fight their own government. And it's the alienation when, imagine this. Imagine you're in your town, your community, and every government official is appointed from the capital, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And Afghans are said that this is democracy. Yes, they have elections for a parliament, which is very weak, and they elect a president. These elections have been marred in enormous amounts of fraud. And you're told that your government supports you, and you actually show up for these elections. You believe in democracy. You actually believe in elections. You participate in political parties. And Afghans have shown themselves capable of doing this, but their government has failed them. And not only that their government failed them, the research that I'm doing now shows that no matter how well these institutions would have worked, they were so dysfunctional from a design perspective that they never actually would have yielded good outcomes in terms of public service delivery. And so they bred corruption. They bred deep, deep senses of alienation. In many communities I'd go to, I would talk about success stories. I would ask people, okay, you solved this dispute in your community, or you went to a governor and you say that you like your district governor. This is the lowest form of government in the country. And why do you like him? Well, he solved the dispute for you. Why did you listen to him? Like, what made you listen to what he said? You could just disobey him, and two parties could disobey him. Well, we liked him. He was from our region, because often they were not. They're appointed. They come from elsewhere. He's from our region. He knows our people. But he said that if we didn't listen to him, he'd send us to the courts. And everybody knows that the courts are the most corrupt public institution in Afghanistan. So this really puzzled me, right? You have these communities who are going to the government, yet the government is not giving them the rule of law. The government is administering customary law, right? And governors shouldn't be resolving disputes. That's actually not in their position description. The courts should be doing that, right? So people are going to they have a demand for the state to do something, but the state in its formal, sense can't provide justice through courts, but the state can substitute for that, by governors behaving in ways that are actually not legal, but very effective. And so it's a really complicated situation. But I think what we should take away from what's happened over these past decades is that you have these really resilient communities who have weathered, enormous conflict over the past several decades. They're strong. They're not going anywhere. But how do we, if social scientists and policymakers are in the job of designing institutions, then what role how do you design formal government institutions that recognizes the ability of these communities to govern themselves? And how can politicians not see this as a threat? And no matter who's been in power in Afghanistan, they have seen these communities as a threat to their power rather than something that complements them and makes them stronger. And this has always been the political challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting that the courts almost exist as like one of these scary monsters that you tell children, be good or I'll send you to the courts. Just almost not as they're not really useful if you actually go to them, but they're a great incentive to solve your disputes in other ways just by how corrupt and ineffective they are.
Right.
Yeah.
And, another interesting dynamic happened, during this period of the surge. It's really interesting if we look back now and compare, I found that the military, NATO forces were actually much more adaptive to what was happening than the humanitarian and the aid community. And this actually surprised me because I had an aid background. I worked for aid agencies prior to going to graduate school. And I was actually inspired to do much of this work because when I was reading about programs designed to help build community governance in Afghanistan, I thought that many of the things that I was reading about were sort of ideal project designs. Like if I could do it, it would look just like what they're doing in Afghanistan. Now, of course, I get to communities and I find something very, very different from what I read about. which led me to change my mind again, right? I think this is why field research is so important. It's easy to have these fixed opinions about things and you see the world and it works in a different way than you have imagined. And this is why doing empirical work is important, or data analysis. But actually getting out there in the field, especially for those of us interested in development, is so very important. I changed my mind about just about everything as a result of the field work that I've done. But the military, and it was like 2006, 2007, there were a bunch of soldiers they started blogs. And they started blogging about how the U.S. military effort was a massive failure and that the U.S. needed to change its war strategy and they were focused too much on the state. And, these were foot soldiers who were encountering some of the worst violence in the country. And they said there was this one whose name, Major Gant was his name. And he actually wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post called "It's the Tribes, Stupid." Mm. And he said that military strategy would be much more effective if it were engaging with these communities, because this is where the power is. And these are the people who the Taliban are actually fighting. And these are the people who the Taliban have brutalized. So if you want to, fight the Taliban, these are the folks you should support. And that really surprised me, right? Because you wouldn't expect the military to be so engaged with sort of local cultural dynamics. And in fact, it spawned a huge effort within the military to understand tribal dynamics, to understand what was happening in communities. And I think one mistake they made was that they could map this all out somehow and understand it all and then derive the right strategy. Sometimes the right strategy is, I think you noted, is just to do nothing. Mm-hmm. But the humanitarian community, rather than try to work with these traditional leaders, they were very normatively opposed to them. They thought, these elders are bad for women. They're bad for all these, social justice kind of objectives that we have. And so we need to replace them with something else. And that was a mistake. And that really, I think, alienated a lot of Afghans from what the international aid community was trying to do, because they just saw this as really normative. So I'd go into communities and they would roll out women for me because they thought that's what I wanted to see. Mm. And I said, I'm just here doing research. Oh, no, but you're a Western woman. So clearly you care about saving the Afghan woman, right? As you've noted.
Yeah.
So here's the women. Look, we've got women. We've got a women's council. Isn't that what you wanted to see? That's what you value. Whereas the military was took a much more pragmatic approach. We'll work with who's there. We need to understand who's there. But the mistake the military made was that they thought okay, now we can create these, work with these traditional councils. And if we pay them well enough, they'll join our side and we'll give them infrastructure and we'll give them things. And this will win hearts and minds. And I think if there's one takeaway from this war in Afghanistan that we should take, every economist, every social scientist, every policymaker should take as we study these conflicts and international intervention, is that stuff does not buy you love. Mm. It's respect. And people need to feel respected. And you cannot buy respect. Respect has to be earned. Trust has to be earned. And so people just wanted to feel respected by their government. And the international community cannot be a replacement for that. No matter how much the international community wanted to help with big hearts, big minds, trying to save communities, people just wanted to feel respected by their state. It's really simple. And they've never felt that. And in all of these years, there has never been an opportunity for Afghans at the local level to have any meaningful dialogue with the state. They have never been able to hold their local governments accountable. There are no local elections. And this is really surprising to me that policymakers who are trying to find a quick exit to Afghanistan and find a way to peace don't consider this as an option. There will not be peace with the Taliban until there's more guarantees of local autonomy. And this, I think, has to be a really important conversation for any way forward.
Yeah, and I think that's a good note to end on. My guest today has been Jennifer Murtazashvili. Jen, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Economics Detective Radio. If you have thoughts on this topic or any other, you can come share them in our Facebook group. That's Economics Detective on Facebook. It's a closed group, so you just need to answer a couple questions to get in. And if you really like the show and you want to support it, we've got a Patreon. That's patreon.com/economicsdetective, where you can make a recurring donation to help support the show. If I can get those numbers up, I can maybe pay other people to do some of the more routine tasks involved with producing the show, and that would just make it easier for me to get episodes out on a regular basis. I know I've been doing pretty well for the last few weeks, and I just hope that as my schedule gets more and more busy, I can keep that up. And with your help, hopefully I can. Anyway, I'll be back next week with a new episode. Thanks for listening.